Okay, so we're going to get started now. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out of their incredibly busy day, busy week. Oh man, busy summer, busy 2020, to focus on what I've always thought is an incredibly important topic in our field, which is that really crucial time where students are transitioning from K-12, from high school, into a college setting, into a higher education environment. And as we'll talk about today, so often that transition is really focused on exactly where we are, the summer in between high school and freshman year of college. What we'll talk about today is how that process actually starts long before a student is ever actually in that active process of switching from a K-12 setting into higher ed. So first, I'd like to thank my partners over at the Center for Transition Innovations at VCU. They've been a fantastic partner to put this together. You likely heard about this event through some of their outreach efforts, and in some way have been connected with them. But I would encourage everybody who's involved today, take some time and look into some of the amazing work that our partners over in CTI are doing. I think you'd find it really worth your while. I'd like to also take a second to introduce myself. My name is Kunkes, and I serve as the Director for the Office of Student Accessibility and Educational Opportunity at Virginia Commonwealth University. I've worked in a higher ed setting for about the past decade. But prior to working in higher ed, I actually worked in a number of secondary, otherwise post-secondary institutions, but also in a public high school in my native state of New Jersey where I grew up. So I've had a real range of the different experiences students, particularly students with disabilities, might have going through their educational experience. So first, let's talk about what we'll be discussing today. We want to address four things as we go through this hour together. The first will be addressing the main differences between disability-related supports for our students in K-12 versus when they get to higher education. We're going to then focus on understanding the accommodation, eligibility, and determination process. So what do accommodations actually look like at the higher ed level? Then we're going to focus on how to set an ideal timeline for actually implementing accommodations, going all the way back into the high school years. And throughout this entire talk today, we'll be addressing some frequently asked questions that always come into offices like ours, and maybe take some time to dispel some common myths and misconceptions that we hear from families, from K-12 counselors, from transition coordinators, from high school teachers, basically from all the people that we expect to be in the room together today. I'd love to hear from each of you too, because it's not just about my experience and the information that I want to share with everybody. I'm interested in your experiences as well, and maybe answering some of the questions that you have that come up throughout the day. So what I'd ask is, because everybody is muted, to be honest, more for my sake, so that I'm able to focus a little bit more on the presentation, if you could add any questions or thoughts you have into the chat box on the side. One of my colleagues from CTI will be monitoring that, and periodically throughout the presentation, we'll stop and address some of the more pertinent questions that come up, but I'll be saving some time at the end of the talk today where I could address any questions that I haven't been able to get to throughout the presentation. So let's start here. And this is probably the most important slide that we'll be going over today. I do want to acknowledge that it was borrowed in part from a slide that I've seen presented from some colleagues by the names of Jane Thierfield Brown and Lorraine Wolf, members of the College Autism Spectrum up in Massachusetts. It's been tweaked a little bit to address more of the conversation today, but I do feel it's important to provide credit where credit's due. So what we'll be looking at today is, how do we actually get to a place where we are providing disability-related supports for students? Well, if we're in a K-12 setting, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is really the basis for all of those supports, at least in terms of the legal basis. When we make the transition over to higher education, IDEA is actually no longer relevant, which happens to be one of the first misconceptions that a lot of people have, or questions that we get asked a lot. Well, if the same rules applied in K-12 under IDEA, why don't they apply in higher education? Well, simply put, the laws dictating what supports are available for students with disabilities changes pretty fundamentally. The only consistency really is the Rehabilitation Act and certain sections like 504, which many of you are probably familiar with. So I want to go through some of the key differences between IDEA and the ADA. The first, which I think is really one of the underlying concepts of our entire talk today, is the idea of how disability is defined. In IDEA, disability falls into one of 12 broad categories. And so students are generally deemed eligible for services if they fall into one of these 13 categories. The ADA looks at disability a little bit different. it focuses more broadly on impairment, not so much disability or categories of disabilities. So when we think about a student who would be eligible for accommodations or disability-related supports in a college or university, the focus there is on the impairment to a major life activity. And that could be anything from thought process, how they interact with a testing setting, how they do in math or English, so many of the other activities that we would do, not just in our academic lives, but our everyday lives that are now taking place on a college campus. And so if we think about what the focus of these two laws are, in IDEA, the focus is on the area of disability and a need for specialized instruction. The ADA focuses more on the actual functional impact of the disability. So it's less about, let's take, for example, ADHD. So just because there's this broad category of ADHD, well, IDEA would suggest that certain services are likely available for a student that falls into that category. Whereas under the ADA, ADHD as a diagnosis is far less relevant than the actual way that the disability affects the student. So looking at things like attentional differences or difficulty sustaining and maintaining attention. So if we think about exactly what kind of law IDEA is at its core an educational law, and it's about entitlement to specific education-related services. So IDEA doesn't actually apply outside of the educational setting. As you likely know, the ADA is much more broad in its scope. It's not focused solely on education. In fact, ADA itself doesn't really address education directly much at all. It's only through interpretations of the ADA and lawsuits over the years since it was implemented back in 1990 that we find how the ADA applies in the educational setting. But at its core, the ADA is really a civil rights law, and it's about eligibility to receive services across all parts of our society. We think about who's actually responsible for setting up services under these two different laws. IDEA focuses on parents doing outreach to a school to provide information about their child, their student, so that the school can then step in and provide the effective services to mitigate the disability. When we look at ADA in higher education, that responsibility shifts, and it shifts in one really fundamental way, which we're going to get into throughout this conversation today. Once we get to higher education, it's not the parent or the school that drives services. It's actually the student themselves. And in conjunction with the student, the university works closely with them to help implement any eligible services, or in many cases, to provide measures of accessibility that, to be frank, a student couldn't implement on their own. So what do these two acts ensure? And this is another one of the really crucial pieces that oftentimes families in particular struggle with understanding the differences. IDEA ensures student success. So if you work in a K-12 setting, it is actually the responsibility of the school to ensure that that student succeeds and to put the supports and services in place to make sure that every one of those students are successful. Now, when we make the transition to higher education, what I don't want people to take away from this talk is that in higher ed, we're not interested in student success. Quite the contrary. It's actually the very core of our mission is to try to help all of our students succeed. But there's no longer a legal requirement that makes it the responsibility of the university for the student to succeed. When we get to higher ed, the ADA dictates equal access. Success is actually up to the student, and it's the university's responsibility to break down the barriers that they might have towards reaching that success. And then the last thing we'll talk about, as far as the differences between IDEA and ADA, is what services they mandate. In K-12, IDEA dictates that evaluation, remediation, and specialized accommodations are offered to students. Once we make that transition to higher ed, evaluation and remediation are actually no longer mandated, and the focus is on reasonable accommodations. And this concept of reasonable accommodations is one we'll be coming back to over and over again throughout the talk. We'll actually spend some time discussing in a little more detail. This is a slide that I tend to share with as many parents and students as I can. I think it's also going to be important to share with everybody in this room today. And to focus on, over time, the differences between K-12 and college when we think about parent involvement in the accommodation process. So if we go all the way back to elementary school and we think about IEP meetings, 504 meetings, or if we're in private schools, the setting up of accommodation plans, You can see it's pretty evenly split between parents doing the outreach to request services and the school responding in kind to put those services into place. At the very top, you'll see that tiny little sliver of student responsibility. Well, in many cases, students are involved in this process at the elementary level, but to a very minimal extent. When we progress through middle school and into high school, that shifts a little bit. We're still the primary responsibility falls on the parents and the school, but more and more we're seeing middle schools and even high schools actually advocating for students to be involved in those meetings, to set up 504 plans, and to set up their accommodations. That model switches pretty significantly when we get to college. And as you'll note here, the biggest chunk of the responsibility is actually on the student. And we'll talk about this student advocacy model that is implemented at most universities and colleges across the country, where still the university is very closely involved in that conversation and helping provide those services. But what you'll notice is the parent's responsibility is very minimal. And that's something that, in our experience, we find parents have a lot of trouble with. Some of our parents have been strong advocates for their students for 12 years coming up to this point and are accustomed to helping their students actually put these accommodations into place. The other side of that equation is that many of our students struggle to actually take the lead in these conversations. And so we'll talk about how important students learning those self-advocacy skills long before they get to college really is in making that smooth transition. And so let's get right into that conversation about self-advocacy. When we talk about accommodations and supports at the higher ed level, it is very much a student-driven model. To be honest, an office like ours, Student Accessibility and Educational Opportunity, or any disability services office across the country, we simply don't know if a student even needs services related to a disability unless they disclose it to our office. So if a student were to come to a university, even if they've had an IEP or a 504 plan in place for their entire life, if they haven't gone through the process of disclosing to our office, letting us know about the services and supports that they would need, there's no way that we as a disability services office or as a university as a whole could ever work with them to put those supports into place. And so one big tip that I want to offer right at the get-go here is if you're in a position to work with middle school or especially high school students in this process, involve them as much as possible. Let them be an active participant in their IEP meetings, in their 504 meetings, and in actually working with their teachers and the different support services and providers that they're working with in high school, so that when they actually make that transition to college, it's not the first time that they're ever having this conversation and speaking on their own behalf. We find that the students that have worked on these self-advocacy skills have the most success in making that transition of any of the students that we work with. And so I'm going to stop now. There's a lot of information to dump right at the beginning of the conversation today, and maybe open it up for a couple of questions. And so if there are any questions that have come through so far, I'd love to take a chance to answer those.
So Ian, we don't have any questions yet, but I'm monitoring the chat to see if people are going to send in questions in the next minute or so. So maybe we'll give it another minute and see if we have any more questions come in.
Absolutely. And I really do encourage you, even if it's just a thought or some feedback as we're going through, the more this can be a conversation today, first of all, the easier it is on me as a presenter. So selfishly, I'd love to answer your questions, but also I want to know how this information applies to the work that you're doing on a daily basis. And so that we can actually make this something that you can really apply in a very practical way, particularly as we're thinking about entering a new school year and maybe working with those students who are coming to college for the first time in, just a couple of days at this point.
So we do have a question. So the question is, do you have any pointers on how to work with parents who may not see the need for a student to take on more responsibility?
Absolutely. The first place I would start with that conversation is to take a step away from the IEP meeting, the 504 meeting, to not make this just about the services that are going to be available during high school or middle school, and actually take the time to focus on what's to come next. To focus on high school as being a stepping stone for something, whether it's college or university, whether it's the professional world, vocational school, but to an environment where there aren't the same levels of services and supports in place, and there's not a team dedicated exclusively to walking the student through this process. But more importantly, to that fateful day when that student turns 18, and the parents can't advocate in the same way that they always have been able to. And so if you start thinking about that reality and working with the family to plan that transition, I think that's a great place to start that conversation. And I also think how you pitch that to a family is important. Instead of saying, look, in a year, mom, dad, you're not going to be part of this conversation at all anymore, so you better back up now. They're not going to be particularly receptive to that. If you focus it on, I really want to make sure that your child is going to be as successful as possible. And one of the skill sets that they're going to need to develop when they make this transition is self-advocacy. Maybe we as a team can try to focus on the best way to help them start developing those skills now, where if something doesn't go right, we are here to help them through it. But they're not first learning about self-advocacy at a point where the safety net that we have around them at the moment is no longer in place. Any other questions that have come through, or should I keep moving?
So no more questions, just some helpful comment from Whitney that I hope everyone will read. So she shares some of her perspective about having those tough conversations with parents. Thanks for sharing that, Whitney.
And please feel free to keep offering thoughts or suggestions to your colleagues and peers. I think that's a great way of using this time. So to keep things moving, a lot of times our office is asked, who exactly is eligible for supports at the college level? When we're talking about disability-related supports, I want to be very clear that there's a broad range of different types of disabilities or impairments that we're going to work with. So certainly, some of the most common that everybody is aware of are students with cognitive, developmental, or learning disabilities. Things like ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, learning disabilities. Our students who have physical or sensory impairments, like those who are blind or low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, or maybe have mobility issues. But what we're actually seeing, the reason I put some stars next to this one is the most quickly increasing population of students at a college campus that are requesting services are students with psychological and emotional issues. So our students who are dealing with anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, or some of the personality disorders that really emerge for the first time when students transition into young adulthood. It used to be that ADHD and learning disabilities were by far the broadest category that we would work with, the largest population of students. And right around a year or two ago, we actually saw this switch. And not to say that students with ADHD, learning disabilities aren't coming for supports in our office. They still are in the same numbers they always have. But there's been such an increase in the psychological and emotional conditions that we're seeing, especially now that we're in this new COVID-19 environment. The amount of students who are disclosing anxiety-related issues, depression, really acute stress disorders over the past 5 months has been skyrocketing. And this is something that we see as being not so much a new frontier because it's been present in the work that we've done for years, but definitely the new, we could call it maybe face of an office like ours, and the new category of students that we're going to be focused on most closely. But of course, then we also work with students who have chronic health issues and medical conditions, or even to some extent, students that have temporary issues. For anyone in here who has ever undergone significant surgery, had a major injury, or sustained a concussion, you would know that while it might not be necessarily a lifelong condition, for the time that you are in recovery, it is absolutely impairing and disabling. And so we'll work temporarily with students who experience those issues as well. And so once we know from a student that they have a disability of some kind, then we start to walk them through the registration process. It's a very simple process, and we try to keep it as easy as possible. It's 3 basic steps. The first one is that we ask students to complete an intake form. This is something that typically takes anywhere from 5 to at most 15, 20 minutes. It's a way for a student to say, this is who I am, this is what my disability is and how it affects me. And these are the accommodations that maybe I've received in the past or are going to be looking for when I come to a university. Step 1 is going to be consistent no matter which college or university in this country that you go to. In fact, I can't even say this country because in working with colleagues abroad, I found that it's pretty much the same registration process. The second step, and we're going to have to go into a little more detail about this one, because this is where there are a lot of misconceptions and some very frequently asked questions that we hear, is that the student has to provide some documentation of the disability. The third step is, once we have the intake form and documentation that was deemed sufficient, they're going to meet with one of the disability service staff members in our office or in the respective office at their university to discuss exactly what services are available and what reasonable accommodations they might be approved for. And we'll also talk today a little bit more about exactly what a reasonable accommodation would look like. And we'll get to that right now. So reasonable accommodations is one of the most basic services that's offered by a disability support office. So this is actually a definition taken right from the Department of Education. It's been in place since 2007. It's still the way that the US Department of Education looks at reasonable accommodation. And I happen to think it actually is a definition that still really applies well. So reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to the tasks, environment, or to the way things are usually done that enable individuals with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to participate in an equal program or a job. The key word there, key words I should say, being equal opportunity. So there's a lot of talk about how accommodations are meant to level the playing field. It's a phrase that's been used in our field for well over a decade, and in many ways it's helpful in trying to talk about how we want to make sure that students with disabilities are treated equally to students that don't have disabilities. But I think this idea, it may be a little antiquated, and there's just a better way of looking at it than evening the playing field. Because to be honest, disability or not, playing fields look very different for students for a broad range of reasons. More and more our society is coming to understand that students from all sorts of marginalized communities may not be coming to a university with an even playing field. And so to use that phrase specifically for students with disabilities, I think does a disservice to all the other students that we're working with at a university, or even to the students we are working with for the other ways in which they may not be facing a level playing field. This idea of equal opportunity, however, focuses on reducing barriers that exist specifically because of the way that a student's disability manifests in the higher education setting. And when we focus more on these equal opportunities and equal access as a means to reducing barriers that exist, then suddenly it's less about the issues the student is facing, their disability specifically, or their impairments, and more focused on the university as a whole and where some of the things that we've set up as an institution might actually be creating barriers to access. And so if we think about the different categories of accommodations, when we're applying it specifically to higher education, it really falls into one of two categories. The first one would be changes that enable a student with a disability to perform the essential functions of an academic program. So some basic things like if a student has an attentional issue and it takes them longer to process information, or let's say dyslexia, like a reading related disability, and it takes them longer to actually read material. If they're going to be taking an exam, for example, we want to ensure that they have sufficient time to actually take that exam, and they're not being penalized because they aren't able to get through an exam in sufficient time. In that case, we're really not assessing how much the student knows. In fact, we're not assessing them in a way that is in any way an equal opportunity to demonstrate exactly what that task has been designed for. But if we're to make some minor changes that still enable the student to perform the essential functions of that program, then we're providing reasonable accommodations. The other category would be changes that enable a student with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of a program. A perfect example here would be, let's take housing accommodations, for example. Many of our students that have, as we talked about earlier, significant mental health concerns, severe anxiety, depression, PTSD, students who maybe can't be in a very hectic, highly populated residential experience. They can't live with multiple roommates. They might come to us and say, I'd like to be able to enjoy all the opportunities that are available through residential living on campus, but I won't be able to do that because of the way my disability affects me in a residential setting if I have 3 roommates. In that case, a reasonable accommodation for the student might actually be altering their housing placement. And so we might be able to switch them, for example, to a single room. I also want to spend some time, as I said, talking about documentation guidelines, because documentation is really one of the ways that we're able to help determine which of these reasonable accommodations a student would be eligible for. I'd also like to preface this by saying, at least at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I think this is a trend that's happening more and more at universities and colleges across the country, we don't want documentation to become a barrier to accessing services in our office. If you were to go back only 5 years ago, a lot of times you would hear from an office like ours, Disability Services Office, a student saying, I don't really have recent documentation. I was diagnosed when I was young. I've been getting services all throughout K-12, but the last letter I have from a psychiatrist, from a medical doctor, was when I was 13 years old. I haven't needed to go back for treatment since, so there was no reason for me to get updated documentation. We don't want to come back to that student with, sorry, no documentation, no support. We're going to find any way we can to work with that student to get the documentation that we need. That being said, documentation guidelines from offices like ours typically request that a student provide something that confirms the presence of a disability or chronic condition. This would have to come from a licensed professional. So we've received letters in the past from, let's say, a high school teacher that said, I'm aware that my student had ADHD. Unfortunately, as we all know, a high school teacher is not really qualified to diagnose ADHD, although I will be the first to say that after years of experience in a classroom, you've probably encountered ADHD more than many physicians have. But that being said, we're looking for this documentation to come from a licensed professional. And what we want is a focus on impairment, not necessarily just a diagnosis or a category. So a simple statement that says, John has ADHD doesn't really tell us much about John or the kinds of supports that he's going to need when he comes to VCU or to a university. If we get a letter that says John has ADHD and the way it manifests is in attentional issues, poor attention, difficulty with working memory, that gives us something to work on where we could actually look at how the impairment is going to affect the student in the academic setting and provide accommodations accordingly. The documentation really should describe the nature of that impairment and the impact it would have in a particular setting. So again, thinking about the example I offered a couple of minutes ago related to housing accommodations, just because a student has, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder, doesn't necessarily mean that they require a single room in the residence hall. In fact, they might find a lot of benefit from living with a roommate and having to share that space as a way to make a transition into that kind of environment. And so we don't want to just assume, in fact, we can't just assume that because a label has been placed on a student, where there's a certain range of services that they should be approved for. It's about what is the impact in a specific setting. And we also want any documentation provided to reflect some form of evaluation recent enough to provide information about how the disability currently impacts the individual. So I know I offered the example already of the student who gives us documentation from when they're 13 years old. Well, to be honest, there's a very big difference between the way that somebody's brain is developed when they're 13 or the way that a disability can manifest at 13 years old when they're in middle school and when they're in college. And so as much as we're able to help that student either get updated documentation from a current provider, or if they don't have access to current documentation, to work with them to maybe find somebody who could provide some information that's a little bit more recent and gives us a sense of how their disability might actually play out in a higher ed setting, that's really going to be helpful. Although there are no concrete timelines, and this is again one of the big misconceptions we hear, the documentation must be 3 to 5 years old. Well, to that I would say, if we have a student who is 30 years old coming to the university, if documentation came in from when they were 25, it's probably still pretty relevant. Although that being said, that might be a little bit of a different story for a student who's coming in at 18 years old when the documentation is from when they were 13 or even younger. So what we want to do is basically see if what's provided can be applied in the higher ed setting and work as holistically as possible with the student to try to figure out how we can use what they're providing or how we can get more information. And so I want to stop for a couple of questions that really come through our office frequently that I would anticipate would be some of the questions that you may have at this point, or maybe things that you have some misconceptions about. And so one of the questions we hear very frequently is, does a student need to provide a comprehensive psychological, particularly if we're looking at a cognitive impairment, like let's say ADHD or an autism spectrum disorder, or a full psychological evaluation if they have, let's say, PTSD, major depressive disorder, or a generalized anxiety disorder? And the answer is an emphatic no. For those of you who aren't aware, some of these comprehensive psychological reports can cost upwards of $2,500. I've seen them cost $3,000. I can't speak for every university in the country, but I know that VCU, for example, is what we would consider an access institution. A large portion of our students are coming from low-income, first-gen families, from communities where spending $3,000 on a psychological report is either out of the question, or to be honest, are coming from communities where mental health services like psychological evaluations might actually be taboo. And so it's not something that a student would ever have undergone in their past. So instead of putting these strict requirements like if you don't have a psychological report, we can't actually help you, we want to take a much more holistic and inclusive approach, recognizing that there's really no one-size-fits-all requirement. For one student that's been working with a psychiatrist for the past 10 years, that person is probably in a great position to provide a statement about how the disability affects a student, even if they haven't done a formal psychological evaluation. But again, we want to make sure that the cost of services, that barriers to receiving services, isn't also a barrier to working with our office. One of the misconceptions that we hear all the time from transition coordinators working in high schools, from guidance counselors, from families and students who are making that transition, is that an IEP plan or a 504 plan actually serves as appropriate documentation. Well, it really depends. I don't want to say no, it doesn't, but I would say not always. Some things that we're looking at when we're looking at an IEP or a 504 plan, what diagnostic information was the plan based on? So how is that IEP or 504 plan actually put together? In some cases, we've seen 504 plans or IEPs that reference testing that was done when somebody was as young as 5 years old. I think it probably goes without saying that if the last diagnostic information or information about impairment that our office gets is referencing something from when the student was 5 years old, that can be very difficult for us to work with. But also, we want to know how recent is the IEP or 504 plan for the very same reason. If you had an updated plan your senior year of high school or even your junior year of high school, that's fantastic. That's something that tells us about who you are really in the last 2 years, which is still very relevant for the work we're doing. If you're handing us an IEP or a 504 plan from middle school, that might be a little bit more difficult for us to work with. And we're also looking at exactly what information is included. Our office sees everything from one-page IEP plans that basically just say, here's the category of disability that the student meets and that they're eligible for some basic services. There's really not much information there. We've also received 40-page IEPs that have very extensive intellectual testing, achievement testing, offers history, really robust reports that give us everything we could ever need to know. And so those are an absolute home run. That's something that we would work with any day. Another misconception about IEPs and 504 plans is that people think an IEP or 504 plan will transfer with the student exactly as it was written in high school to college. Well, and the answer to that is, well, sort of. There's a yes and no to that. Some supports would absolutely transfer. Something like additional time for taking exams would be an absolutely reasonable accommodation for a student if they received it in high school to look into in college. Certainly something like a student who uses sign language interpreters because they're deaf or hard of hearing. If they were using those services in high school, there's really nothing different to the higher ed setting that suggests they would no longer need sign language interpreters. If that's part of an IEP, it's great information for us to start planning for supports at the college level. But what we see a lot of times, going back to that conversation about the differences between IDEA and the Americans with Disabilities Act and the services that we're providing students, is that many supports offered at the K-12 level may no longer be considered reasonable in a higher education setting. And so two of the really popular ones that students come saying, well, these are the main accommodations I need, and I've been told for the past 10 years that these will transition with me right to college. Those include having study guides provided by the instructor, or being able to use memory aids, or what we would commonly refer to as cheat sheets during exams. A lot of times at the high school level, students are provided with study guides for exams, or they're allowed to bring a note card or do an open book. Unfortunately, at the college level, this is no longer considered a reasonable accommodation. Similarly, copies of instructor notes. At the K-12 level, teachers always have lesson plans. They're always working off of notes to guide their conversations with students. If you think about the college level, many of our professors have been teaching the same classes for 20, 30 years. They're experts in their field, and to be honest, they don't have notes that they're working off of. They're lecturing off of their experience and memory. And so there are no notes to provide to the student. And we can't require a professor to start making notes for each of their lectures to provide to that student. So there really is a difference between some of what's reasonable at the K-12 level, and we might see in an IEP plan or a 504 plan, and what would be reasonable and transferable to the college and university setting. So again, I've been talking for a while. I want to take a little break to open it up to some conversations and to some questions.
All right, so we got some questions about what documents could be submitted. So the first one is, could a student or family member submit letters from their case manager and other teachers stating how their disability has affected them in the classroom?
So absolutely. An office like ours would love to see those kinds of statements written from educational professionals, because it would give us a great idea of, in the classroom, exactly what it is that you see with the student, what strategies you've worked with the student on that maybe we could in some way mimic and mirror in the way that's appropriate at the college level. That being said, when we're talking about diagnostic information, we're talking about disability-related impairments, we do need an appropriately licensed professional to be sharing this kind of information. And so while we would love to get that information from a teacher, we are looking for somebody who is a licensed professional to discuss that type of a disability. So for example, a medical professional, if it's some kind of chronic health condition, a therapist or counselor, even to some extent a pediatrician, if it's more of a learning related issue or something like ADHD or an autism spectrum disorder.
Thank you. So the next question is, what about submitting a summary of performance from their existing IEP? That's usually the most current documentation regarding the impact of disability and current levels of performance.
It really depends on what that summary of performance is related to. So I've seen summary of performances that talk about how somebody does in a math class versus a history class versus an English class. And to be honest, that actually isn't particularly helpful for an office like ours, because it's not telling us any information about disability. It's talking to us about performance in different subject areas. If, however, you're talking about progress with some of the IEP goals, that could be much more helpful and definitely something that we would consider.
Okay, great. So last one, in addition to their IEP, should they submit or send their last documentation of eligibility for receiving special education services?
Again, and absolutely something that we would want to look at. What I try to stress to families is we don't need a packet of 500 pages of every document you ever received going back to kindergarten. Although we receive them and we will run them through a scanner, even if it takes 5 hours to do it, and enter them into our system. What we really want to focus on is, what is the impairment at the time that you're making this transition? How has it affected you recently? And so whatever information a family wants to provide is something that we would absolutely accept. The thing that I would love to stress to anybody who's helping a student make this transition from high school into college is, think outside of just the school setting. Keep in mind that when we're talking college and university life, we're not just talking about being in a classroom, taking exams. We're not just talking about studying. This is an entire environment. This is their new community. So the focus is going to be more broadly on how a student interacts with all aspects of life. And so one of the best things that you can do is help stress that to a family and say, well, we could provide educational records. You really want to focus on getting records that are a little more holistic in what they cover for the student. And so talking to a pediatrician, talking to any medical providers, any counselors or therapists would also help complement anything that the school could provide. I would also say, just to give a closing thought on this one, probably a quarter or less of the documentation that we receive from students is actually coming directly from high school. Most of it is from non-K-12 providers, if that offers any information about exactly what it is that families provide and what we typically look for. All right, I'm going to keep moving, but certainly we'll have those questions open and we'll take some time to address them as they come through. So now I want to actually look at making that transition. We talked through the differences between K-12 and higher ed. We've talked through what the registration process looks like and how to start thinking about the differences between that environment and the one that a student would be entering. We've also talked about reasonable accommodations, and now it's focusing on what you can be doing, really starting from high school to help a student prepare to make that transition. So we've already talked a little bit about how you can help work with a family to understand that it's going to be this very student-driven model. And that should be one recommendation that underlies everything that I say, everything that you could be doing with a family, because it is the most essential part of a successful transition. But there's also a timeline that we could think about in order for a student to be set up for services right when they're most needed. So we talked about the intake process. So when the best time to provide intake paperwork and documentation would be really ideally in the late spring or early to summer. So basically over the past 6 months. So here we are now, about a week and a half away from the first day of classes, which probably saying that out loud makes a couple of my hairs go gray. So I don't want to say that too many times out loud, but I have to acknowledge that we are, again, right up against the new semester. Now is an appropriate time for students to be reaching out to our office, but even better than right now would have been 6 months ago. In fact, we spent an entire summer working with students who've already reached out and gone through the registration process, and about 200 students have already worked with our office this summer to get approved for accommodations, and they now know exactly what they're going to be working with their instructors on when they get to classes in, again, just a couple of weeks. So the second thing that we want to focus on for this timeline would be when to officially register and meet with the Disability Services team. Well, if we've gotten the intake paperwork and documentation late spring, so thinking April, May, June, or those early summer months, then by the time we hit late June, July, or the beginning of August, like we're doing right now, we can be having those intake meetings to approve accommodations before the student ever even gets to campus. Now, it's not that they have to do this before they get to campus. We're just talking about that ideal transition here. So when we think about actually implementing accommodations, so once a student has been approved for accommodations, the first day of the semester is when a student wants to reach out to a professor and let them know, I have been approved for accommodations at the university. An office like ours would provide a student a copy of their accommodation letter that the student could then share with the instructor. So having the students set up a conversation with their instructor, not just dropping that letter on the desk or, given the virtual environment that we're in right now, emailing it to the professor and never following up. We want that letter to serve as a great conversation starter where a student can say, I've been approved for these accommodations. Can we talk through exactly how this will apply in your particular class? The earlier that a student does that, the better. One of the main takeaways that we try to get across to our students when we work with them is that accommodations are never retroactive. So very frequently, we first get students registering for accommodations midway through the semester after something's gone wrong. A classic example that we see is a student who takes their first midterm and comes back to us to say, it was 50 multiple choice questions. I finished the first 30 and I got every one of them right, but I failed the exam because I didn't finish the last 20. And that was only because of my disability. Well, we agree that that's probably not a fair way to assess a student. The problem is we can't go back in time and apply an accommodation retroactively. And so we would want that student to set up a meeting with our office, register for accommodations, which it sounds like they might be eligible for, so that we can set this up moving forward. But even better than that is having never gotten to that place to begin with, where the student would have already started this process, talked to their professor, and gotten that extra time set up for the exam. And then revisiting accommodations is an important part of this timeline, and that could happen anytime. So we try to stress to students, your intake meeting with our office should not be a one and done experience. There are some students that register for accommodations with us, and the only time we ever hear from them is the beginning of each semester when they request an updated copy of their accommodation letter. But we have students who are in our office weekly, who stop by our office just to say hello, to talk to their case managers, or who each semester want to reach out to have a conversation about what is my accommodation letter going to look like in this new semester? I have different types of classes. Do I maybe need to consider alternative accommodations? But that conversation should be ongoing, and we want to revisit those accommodations with the student whenever they need to. So again, getting into a couple of frequently asked questions about this timeline. So one that comes up all the time is, what if a student doesn't start the process until mid-semester or later? Well, we're going to work with the student the second we hear from them. It doesn't matter if it's the last day of the semester. We'll still work with the student. We might not be able to set accommodations up for that semester if it is the last day, but we're happy to start that conversation. We also know that many students simply don't require supports or accommodations initially. One of the earlier slides pointed out that we work with students with temporary conditions. So for example, a student who sustains a concussion their sophomore year of high school. Well, it's likely that they wouldn't have needed accommodations their freshman year, but this is a new reason why they do want to reach out to us. And if it happens mid-semester, that's a great time for us to start working together. Or one thing that we see pretty frequently is 18 to 22-year-old, that traditional college-age student also happens to coincide with the emergence of a lot of mental health conditions. And so many of the personality disorders, anxiety disorders, major depressive disorders, first start really emerging when student is in those typical college years. And so a student may first start to gain that self-awareness that something might be a little bit wrong, or they need some kind of support that they didn't need in the past for the first time when they're at the university level. Absolutely a time for students to reach out to our office. And again, one thing that I want to stress is that accommodations aren't retroactive. And so we want to make sure that whenever the student starts that process with us, we're working with them as quickly as possible because we can't go back in time. I'd also like to turn away from just reasonable accommodations for a moment and talk about the broad range of services that are available on a college campus. There are a lot of services for students with disabilities that go well beyond just reasonable accommodations. So obviously, as we've talked about for most of our time together today, most universities, in fact, I would argue nearly all universities at this point, have a disability services office. These are obviously specific for students who have disabilities. Offices like ours also typically will run some version of a testing center, specifically for students who require certain kinds of testing related accommodations. But there are also services that are available, not just for students who have disabilities, but might really be helpful for the student population that we're serving, but also happen to be available for any student on campus. And these are things like writing centers, tutoring services. If the university is focused on student wellness, they're likely to have a counseling center of some kind or some version of student health services. And then there are those services that are a little more unique to individual campuses. Some of these, for example, we have at VCU. Some we don't, but are available at other universities across the country. So for example, academic coaching programs or learning specialist programs, where the focus is not on accommodations, but on helping students develop skill sets like time management, better organization, developing better study skills, or more appropriate communication skills in a higher ed setting. Some universities offer peer mentoring programs. Some universities will set up sensory rooms for our students who have, let's say, anxiety disorders or autism spectrum disorders, and need places on campus where they can go to de-stress, maybe to go if they're overstimulated. So as an example, in the Disability Services Office at VCU, we actually maintain a sensory room that's open to students whenever they want to use it. Some campuses will have specific student organizations that are geared especially for students with disabilities. In fact, again, I'll reference one of the great organizations at VCU as a perfect example of this. About 3 years ago, a group of students all registered with our office independently got together and created a student organization called the Association for Students with Disabilities and Chronic Conditions. That group at its peak had over 40 members, and they were meeting multiple times throughout the semester to put together awareness programs related to disabilities, but also to have that opportunity to just get together in a sense of fellowship with people who might uniquely relate to them. Things like neurodiversity groups. Many universities provide summer bridge programs, which are particularly relevant to our topic today on transition. Some universities will offer non-degree seeking vocational programs. And then some universities, and I'll cite our colleagues over at George Mason as a great example, really one of the best in the country, have specific programs that focus on individual populations of students. At George Mason specifically, they have a program for students with autism that I would say is second to none on a college campus across the country. And we're just very lucky here in the Commonwealth to have it in our backyard. So now again, I want to open up for some questions about the student timeline for setting up supports or some of the other services that are available on a college campus.
So we have one question so far, and it's about whether if a student experiencing anxiety or other mental health issues that affect their learning, should they go to both counseling and disability support services?
Absolutely. What I would say to that one is whichever office that student goes to, they likely will also get a referral to the other. So if a student were looking for more mental health related services, counseling, or therapeutic services, Disabilities Services Office do not provide those services. In fact, we make a very concrete distinction between the work that we do with students, which is more coaching in nature and about access, as opposed to what a student counseling center would do, which is more therapeutic in nature. Many of our students are working with both offices, but for very different reasons. So if you were to understand a student needed some kind of support related to an anxiety disorder or other mental health impairment, the question first becomes, what kind of support are they looking for? And that helps you make that initial referral. But of course, letting a student know about one of our offices ultimately will lead to a referral to the other one.
Thanks for clarifying, Ian. No more questions.
Okay. And so again, a couple of questions that I receive pretty frequently that I thought we would go through together today. One question would be, when should a student disclose a disability to a university? If you're working with students who are juniors or seniors this year, they're likely thinking about that application process. Where am I going to apply? Should I disclose a disability in my application? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. So my question for a student who's thinking about the application process would be, what purpose would disclosing that disability serve? Are you looking for some kind of accommodations in the application process? For example, is the application not accessible to you because you have some disability that might affect how you actually interact with their form? Are you going on an interview and maybe you need some assistance related to that interview? Are you going to be writing a personal statement of some kind? If you are, and you think your experience as a person with a disability is something worth talking about, that could be a really great way to approach a personal statement and a way to talk about your lived experiences and what makes you a unique candidate for that institution. In that case, absolutely something to consider adding to an application process. But again, the question becomes, is there a purpose that disclosing would serve? If not, really not necessary to disclose at that point. Do you have to disclose once accepted? The answer again is, no, you don't have to disclose. You don't have to disclose at any time. But sometimes students find that once they're accepted to the university, and they've likely been accepted to other universities as well, they really want to know, based on their particular disability and the university, what services could be available to them. And that's a great way to find out exactly which university might be the best fit. Because to be completely honest, if you're going to an Ivy League institution that has terrible disability supports, not to say that any of the Ivy League institutions do have terrible disability supports, but just as an example, is that going to be the right environment for you when another university that may not be considered as, let's say, prestigious, would have far better supports to help provide you the opportunities to be much more successful in that environment? That might be a reason to share your disability in order to figure out what's going to be the best environment and best fit for me. And certainly once you're on a campus, we know many students that just don't want to disclose because they don't need accommodations of any kind. There's really no reason for them to disclose. But if you're looking for services, like we've talked about today, of course that disclosure is part of the process of getting them set up. Another question that we hear pretty frequently is, how should a student use all this information in their college selection process? This is one thing that I'm hoping everybody that's in a middle school, high school, K-12 setting really shares with the students that you're working with. Because this is oftentimes an afterthought in the college selection process, when I would argue it's going to be one of the most important parts of a student's experience. What we want to do is take time to look at the different universities that you'd consider applying to. Explore what resources you need as a student and see if those resources are going to be available for you. For a student who says, I'm really going to need, or a family for that matter, who says, we're going to need somebody that could check in on a weekly basis with our student because of their autism spectrum disorder and how it affects their participation. Well, many of the universities, even here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, don't really have a resource available to check in with a student each and every week. If that's a make or break resource for a family, they need to know exactly which universities offer that kind of resource. Also thinking about the size of a campus. Many of our students would benefit from much smaller class sizes, smaller campuses where they don't feel like they're getting lost in a large urban environment. Some of our students, conversely, really want a larger environment, a place where they don't feel like there's a spotlight on them all the time because they're only one of 10 students in a classroom. certainly you want to look into the disability services offices. And I will say that not all disability services offices are created equally. There are some offices that are run entirely by one person. There are some, again, even here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that are staffed by 10, 15 people and have really robust services, are well supported and funded by the university. So knowing what that office looks like and how they'd be working with a student is going to be a really important piece of information to consider during that selection process. And again, certainly any special programs that are offered at the university, whether it be a program for students with an autism spectrum disorder, or a university like VCU that might offer learning specialist programs. And that's where I want to wrap up for today. I know we're coming up to the end of the hour, so I'd like to open it up for just a couple more minutes to any closing questions that anybody has, or any additional thoughts that they'd like to share.
All right, Ian, so we have a couple questions. The first one is, can you describe the means you're using to facilitate virtual conversations between students and professors?
Yeah, so that's a very timely question. Like many of you, thinking back to that awful month of March, we had very little notice that we were going to be transitioning from our standard campus environment to a virtual environment. And the learning curve was incredibly steep, although I will say it's been pretty amazing to see how higher education has responded. Many of our professors who had never used platforms like Zoom, Google Meet, WebEx, all these virtual environments, or honestly, even never thought to pick up a phone and call a student, had to learn exactly those skills. So for our students who do need to stay regularly engaged with their professors, many of those instructors have now learned how to use these platforms like Zoom, like Google Meet, or just picking up the phone and having those conversations. And so there's really not much our office needs to do to help facilitate that conversation. Although we've certainly been called in to help a number of times, particularly when we're thinking about things like, I'll give you a very concrete example. We had a student at the university last semester who relied on American Sign Language in order to hear what was going on in the class or to engage with a meeting. We had never set up sign language over a Zoom meeting before. And so we were able to work with the instructor and our interpreters to figure out a really effective way of using Zoom and having interpreters brought in. Similarly, today's Zoom meeting is actually being closed captioned. And so we're doing things like having closed captioning done on many of those conversations. Now, sometimes it's things that students have to request specifically for individual meetings. For some of our large classes or big programs, like for example, commencement or some of our orientation sessions, we're just embedding those basic principles of accessibility right in from the get-go.
All right, so another question, and let me know if you'd like more context about this one. The question is, are there colleges that have a separate application process for support services?
Well, for support services, I would say yes, although I'm not sure if this is exactly the answer to the question you're asking. So for example, I would consider the work that our team does in the Student Accessibility and Educational Opportunity Office a support service. And you do actually have to apply specifically for the services from our office. Now, that's not to say that we're going to deny you access to the university through that process like you would in a regular admissions process. But if you want to request accommodations, there is an application process for that. There are some other services on campuses, like for example, I mentioned the George Mason Autism Program, that a student, once they've been accepted to the university, would have to apply for. And there would be a registration process and an application process for that kind of a program. For something like our counseling center or student health services, you would show up just like you would to any other therapeutic service, to any other medical service. And so not so much of an application process.
Thanks, Ian. No more questions in the chat for now.
Perfect. Well, that brings us right to the end of the hour. So I'd like again to thank everybody for coming today. I saw a number of people came into the meeting throughout, so please feel free. I believe this recording is going to be made available to everybody. Check back in at the beginning. I think there was some particularly pertinent information in the first couple of slides. But also, if you have any other questions, I would stress anytime reach out to an office like ours. If you're in a region that has another university or college, typically you'll find disability service professionals are thrilled to engage with our K-12 colleagues, mostly because the work that we do on a daily basis, even though we're never coming face to face with one another, is so closely tied up into one another. The support that you're providing your students at the K-12 level directly affects what we're able to do with them at the higher ed level. And we are huge proponents of the work that you're doing. We're grateful for all the services that are being provided for our students, and we see the impact of quality intervention that's being done at that K-12 level to help prepare students to be as successful as possible. The thing that we'd most love to see improved upon would be these transition processes. And I will be the first to say, the past couple of years, we've seen huge strides made in how students are transitioning to higher education. And I think it's because of conversations just like this one. So thank you for taking the time today to engage in it. And I encourage you as much as possible, keep this conversation going within your local schools, with your colleagues, and most importantly, with the students and families that you're working with.